Hi, Misha here, and recently we looked at a new Hobbymaster 172 scale diecast I picked up, the Israeli IDF F-16I Sufa Storm. This was the most recent version of the F-16 sold to Israel, and one I kind of needed to complete my set here, and I just kind of wanted it. They haven't made them in a couple of years and seemed like a good time. Picked it up from Pete's. Actually, most of these came from Pete's. So while I had these all off the shelf, it seemed like a good time to dust them off. Brought out the Israeli F-15s as well. But that's for another video. In this one, I thought we would just revisit the F-16 in Israeli service, talk about the generations from the earliest Block 5 and 10s they had, all the way through, of course, the Block 52. Although, since we just recently covered it in detail, I'll probably just skim that today. And we have pretty much representations of every piece marble, 1 through 5 here, which was kind of the name under the program that the U.S. sold to them. The F-15s had their own program name. And they also were called the Baz, at least the earlier versions in Israeli service. So with that, let's go back to the original piece marble and what Israel called the Netz. One more thing before we dive in. It's just a note, because this is primarily about the real world history. But to talk about these models, they're all 172 scale diecast. And all from Hobbymaster, even the F-15s over here. And they're very nice. At least one of them has taken a tumble off the shelf and survived, so it's one thing I like. And it will happen. It actually got hooked by a headphone cord that I didn't know had slipped around it, and so when I pulled away, whoop, but there you go. They also all have opening and closing cockpits, optional weapons you can switch around, and they have landing gear you can insert as full assemblies to have the gear down or up. These are on the standard stands. More recently, Hobbymaster has offered a different style here, so you can use the centerline hardpoint. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that because lots of model makers do the F-16, of course. But I've just found the Hobbymasters kind of suit me best. And they do a lot of variations and styles, including a NASA one that's, well, anything NASA I like. But we're not going quite back to space yet. Nope, we're going to hang out with the Israeli Defense, Israeli Air Force. On to the spinny thingy my Block 10 goes. Although this might have started off as a Block 5. I'll explain. Israel had kind of been shopping around for aircraft in the 70s. They were previously operating Mirages and some domestic variants of the Mirage. But they needed a next-generation air superiority fighter, and they needed just a long-range multi-role fighter. And they would pick up the F-15 in relatively small numbers, but they were very expensive, and the U.S. was not able to provide all that many anyway. But they were quite interested in the F-16. In 1978, the talks began. Timing was good because Iran was flipping, and Iran had an order for F-16s, but that was officially canceled in 1979. So Iran's on the outs with the U.S. now. And at the time, Israel is in good graces with the Carter administration because of successful peace talks with Egypt. And yeah, after decades of warring, the two nations kind of buried the hatchet. So that positioned Israel in a good way. And this would result in Peace Marble 1, which was an agreement to provide 75 F-16A single-seat and F-16B two-seaters to the IAF. Most of these would be the A. And the deliveries would begin. Things would be signed in January of 1980, and the first aircraft would be delivered shortly thereafter, because again, they were already working on a contract for Iran. The first ones would be delivered in July of 1980, and then, of course, they would subsequently be sent over in batches. And it wouldn't be long before these were put into combat. By April of 1981, now under the Reagan administration, they would shoot down some helicopters for the first time. And in July of that year, the F-16 would have its first air-to-air victory. It would be over a MiG-21 anywhere in the world, not just with Israel, but anywhere. Quite impressive. However, going back to June 7 of that year, there was a much more controversial mission, and that's what this model is kind of patterned after. This is the Iraqi reactor strike variant. And this was really pushing the F-16. True, it was a multi-role fighter, but they went over 1,000 miles, which is beyond its range, with 3 fuel tanks. They had some Sidewinder missiles for defense, but 8 of these were sent as primary bombers. They each carried 2 2,000-pound bombs, and they were escorted by 6 F-15As from the IAF. This was done to put a halt, or at least suspend, Saddam Hussein's nuclear program, and was very successful. These flew just over, well, I'd say tree top level, but this is the desert, so I don't know, rock top level, and delivered their ordnance. They all returned home. Even there were minimal casualties for the Iraqis. I think 8 folks died, which is, tragic in and of itself. They're just guys doing their job. But it could have been far worse because they did devastate the factory. Luckily, their timing was good. They were around supper time, so people were not at their posts. And this was a mixed bag because part of Peace Marble, these were being sold to Israel to be used only in defense. And now, Israel claimed this was a preemptive strike and it was still defensive in nature. That's kind of, yeah. And publicly, the Reagan administration kind of had to condemn it. Privately, he actually complimented them. Either way, after a little bit of wiggling and diggling, later that year, the remaining 22 aircraft that had not been delivered in the initial order were sent over. They were able to loosen things up, and that's where it went. And this kind of emboldened Israel. In 1982, they continued to fly the F-16, including during the Lebanon War, and they would shoot down several Syrian MiG-21s. They would also begin tangling with the MiG-23, quite a modern fighter for that day and time. And it would quickly rack up quite a good record. In that war, they shot down around 90 aircraft, and basically half of them were shot down by F-16s. And there were no F-16 losses to enemy fire. But it was proving to be very successful. But of course, this was the original version. I don't want to say primitive, but it's the block. Now, these were all block 10, but some of them started off as block 5, but were upgraded to block 10 standard. The same thing happened in the U.S. Air Force, because the differences between block 1, 5, and 10 were just kind of quality of life improvements. With block 15, though, we start to see more substantive steps up. And like I said at the beginning, these were called Netz, or Hawk, in Israel. Next up, we have a very similar F-16A, but it's somewhat upgraded. One thing that Israel wanted for their even initial Netz were chaff and flare dispensers. The Block 15 series over in America was kind of the first big update to the design. They gave it a better radar. They installed 2 hard points, attachment points under the fuselage called chin points, although they're of limited use at this exact time. And they made some other quality of life improvements, including going to slightly larger stabilizers in the back here, a little bit more instrumentation. Next would be the Block 20, which was a pretty limited series, but this would see improved computers first used. And we would start to see better weapons compatibility. For example, these would be the first ones that the AIM-120 MROMs could be used from. Also, by this time, underwing carriage is a little bit better. You can carry a little more under the hard points. But Israel really didn't get any of these, although they might have upgraded with some of the hardware. That was what was kind of just going on. They would continue to fly theirs, Lebanon fighting Syrians in 84, 85, till they got out. Maybe a little controversial, but if you're just looking at it from a military perspective, very effective. I should point out this one here is actually the IDF F-16 commemorative version. I got this from Aikens. I just thought it was neat. It came with a special plaque. It came with a picture. It came with some stories. And it was just kind of a unique version, and they had a sale where I could pick it up cheap enough. I don't know. I just did. Otherwise, it's set up very similar because with the initial A models and B models, they were pretty much able to use last generation missiles like the AIM-9 Sidewinder, the earlier versions, and most of their air-to-surface ordinances were just kind of dumb. Iron bombs and cluster bombs, rockets, that kind of thing. They could still carry over 7,000 kilos of payload. They could carry up to 3 drop tanks. And they were working on them, improving them all the time. And their low-level performance was quite good. They were, of course, supersonic and quite affordable. But with the activities, Lebanon engaging the Syrians, this would lead to Peace Marble 2 in 1986. And this is when Israel would jump from the F-16AB to the F-16C D series. This may be one of my favorite F-16s that I have. I don't know. It's just unique. We're actually going to skip ahead to the Barak 2, the Lightning II, but don't worry, we'll come back to the 1. Like I said, talks began in 86, and at that time, America had really progressed. We have the F-16C and F-16D, again, single seat versus 2, and they begin with the Block 25, but very soon progress to the Block 30. What we're doing here is we're improving the ability to work at night. We're really expanding weapons carriage capabilities and really giving it a more modern cockpit, multi-function displays, more oomph. Very soon they would go to an upgraded Pratt & Whitney engine. They would continue to improve and modernize the radar system. Mostly it was just weapons carriages and other quality of life, and we start to see lantern pods and other things being used with this series. And Israel was quite interested. They would actually pick up 75 Block 30 aircraft, 51 single seat, and 24 twin seat. And they would get their first single-seater October of 87 and their first twin in December of 87. And because this is Israel, they very quickly pressed these into service, attacking what they claimed to be terrorist camps in April of 88. And pilot feedback was very positive for the new Barak, as it was known, the Lightning. They liked its speed, its expanded all-weather capabilities, the newer weapons, and the much nicer, more user-friendly, efficient cockpit. And the orders would be fulfilled that year, giving 75 new aircraft to the IAF. And at this time, they were expecting to go to a domestic produced, designed fighter. So Peace Marble 2 here was kind of thought to be the final one, but later that year, budget cuts and just, looking at really what was realistic, they canceled it, and this would lead to Peace Marble 3. Very soon after the end of Peace Marble 2, talks would begin for 3, and this would result in Israel purchasing Block 40 aircraft. they would get a total of 60. Interesting that now we're going to 30 single seat and 30 twin seat. They're starting to balance it out. And the reason I say interesting, they initially really just took the two-seaters as training aircraft, but they're starting to really see the utility in them, using the back-seater as a weapons officer. And unique to the Israeli Block 40s was this spine. This was to house additional avionics, electronics, ECM, sensors, just gear. You don't see it on the Block 40Cs, but you do see it on the Block 40D two-seaters, because they started to use these as Wild Weasel, or what we would think of as Wild Weasel aircraft. Now, the big difference between the Block 30 and the Block 40 was the night capabilities. They had expanded all-weather capabilities, night capabilities, better compatibility with Lantern Pod, and they had a GPS receiver for guided munitions. Often these are nicknamed the Night Falcon. Now, in the beginning, the cockpit wasn't really NGV compatible, but later on this would be added in both the U.S. Air Force and Israeli. And we have the uprated engine. Now, something that also happened, you notice there's the Block 30 or 32, Block 40 or 42. In the mid-'80s, they went to the alternative engine program, so F-16s were either produced with the Pratt & Whitney or the General Electric. And the 30-40 would be General Electric, the 32-42 would be the Pratt & Whitney. Just thought I'd point that out. Kind of a little difference there. Again, expanded sensors, what have you. Anyway, the Peace Marble 3 night-capable aircraft, not that the ones couldn't operate at night before, but a lot better, safer now, were known as Barak 2, and it'd take a little while to get these delivered. The first ones would not appear until actually after the Gulf War, so August 1991. And the final ones would be delivered to Israel in 1993. So, yeah. Now, they took 60. They actually had an option to take another 15 in the contract. But for various reasons, it does not seem like they exercised this. Instead, they kind of set about a midlife upgrade program. And then, of course, there was Peace Marble 4, too, which was a little different than the previous versions. Now we have the Barak 1 on the stand, the F-16C Block 30, although this is a version that has already gone through the midlife upgrade program in Israel, sometimes called the Barak 2020 model. So that's why I wanted to talk about it second. I also want to mention that the Block 40s were among the first to have more customized features for Israel, including some Israeli-made or provided avionics, electronics, and compatibility with some Israeli-specific weapons systems. Just thought I'd mention that because it kind of informs Peace Marble 5. But Peace Marble 4 was actually more of these. In 1991, after the Gulf War, the U.S. was complimentary of Israel's restraint in not responding and not retaliating against its Rocky Scud missiles. So, amongst other things, as a little reward, they gave them 50 surplus U.S. Air Force older F-16As and Bs. It was a mix, and some were Block 1, some were 5, some were 15, what have you. And Israel's plan was to upgrade them and use them as primarily trainers. And Peace Marble 4 aircraft, 50, were agreed upon. They were all delivered in the latter half of 1994. Remember, Peace Marble 3 was over by 1993, so that makes sense. Boop. Now, they'd already been working on a midlife upgrade for their F-16A and F-16B Netz since 1992. This would be giving a new wing, upgrading the avionics, the computer systems, weapons compatibility. Basically, when they were done, they were hybrids. They were F-16ABs but with many compatibilities of F-16 CDs, but they still retain the older engine, the older Pratt & Whitney engine, so a little bit underpowered. I should also mention that when they started receiving the surplus ABs in 1994, they named these the Netz 2, and they would similarly be upgraded over the next few years within Israel. And of course, this would lead in 1997 to the beginning of Peace Marble 5, which we talked about in a recent video with the F-16I. And that would be quite successful. Now, with their older aircraft, their Cs and Ds, they would begin a midlife upgrade in the 21st century with these. And primarily the work was done between 2011 and 2014, although some work extended out from that. After they saw the I, and it was kind of a similar thing. Just as they'd previously upgraded ABs to the CD standard, now they're upgrading the CDs to the I standard, the current standard. This would actually allow them to fully retire the AB fleet, which for years had only been used as training aircraft and aggressor aircraft and emergency aircraft, then go ahead and fully retire them. They had received a total of 125 early generation planes, and of those, 40 were still deemed flight worthy and had some life in them, and so they would actually shop around to sell them to someone else. At one time, they were talking about selling them to Jordan. Not actually sure what came of that. But for the upgraded aircraft, that's what this represents here. And of course, it's on the different Hobbymaster stand. You can note the AMRAAMs, the AIM-120s on the wingtips. It also has the Python 4 missiles under the wings. It has guided ordnance. And it has both Lightning and Lantern pods. Although early on they actually used the Sniper pod instead of the Lightning pod. So they went through a few generations. And they would have night vision compatible cockpits, modern GPS, all that good stuff. So the Barak 1s and 2s were upgraded and would continue on, are still on service, but that would get their fleet at least somewhat modernized, and they would continue to serve. Even though the I was the newest thing in 2006, plenty of Cs and Ds would serve in the wars from that time period through present day and are still being flown. It's worth pointing out the single-seaters never had the spine like the twin-seaters because they weren't expected to be used as wild weasels. But more and more we're seeing Israeli customization in avionics, and I think it's neat. I really do. And at this point, this is a true multi-role aircraft. And just because I am a completionist, let's put the F-16I, the Sufa, back on the stand for just a minute. I think this really does show how this progressed, why they ended up purchasing only twin-seaters. And originally they were going mostly single-seaters. But once they really figured out what the aircraft was good at, they realized that the twin-seat role was better. Plus, by this point, they've retired their older F-4 Phantoms, and something needed to take its place. A lot of the technology started off on the Block 40 Barak 2s, including the spine. They even tested conformal fuel tanks on these in 1999, 2000, that era. They tested guided precision ordnance on these, compatibility with various pods, newer cockpits, receivers, data links, and you see all this kind of wrapped up here. This is based on the Block 52, to be specific, the Block 52 Plus, because of the fuel tanks, which was a very modern aircraft at that time. These did not go into military service anywhere until 2003, so when Israel was receiving them, they were only the second or third Air Force to really fly the Plus version, although the original Block 52 had been in U.S. Air Force service for some time. But this was the first to use the AIM-120. It also uses not only the Python 4, but the newer Python 5. It uses the longer range Derby missile as well. And of course, it uses lots of air-to-surface munitions. It uses newer targeting pods like Lightning II. Still has Lantern Pod, of course, for night compatibility. Fully night vision compatible cockpit. And one neat thing that I think they did with these was changing up the avionics so that really with the flip of a switch, it can go from the backseater being a weapons officer to an instructor. So you can use the same exact aircraft for live fire operations or training operations, which explains why they purchased more of these than any other single piece marvel. 102 were ultimately purchased, although they technically had an option to purchase up to 110. And when they were getting these, that expanded their fleet all the way up to 362, at least theoretically, that had been in service, although of course some were lost to attrition. And the bulk had been the A and B. Like I said a minute ago, they had 125 sold to them, given to them. And so getting 102 of these let those get replaced, the ones that were still around, and kind of left the C's and D's, Block 30s and 40s as the interim. It's also interesting that this is the 52, not a 50, meaning that it does use the Pratt & Whitney. Of course, this is the IPE, the Increased Performance Engine, and it's actually the same engine essentially in the F-15I, which just logistically makes a lot of sense, and it's a good engine, so why not? But it is worth kind of pointing that out. But yeah, these started to see combat service in 2006 alongside older versions, and they're still very much frontline today. But for more on the Sufa, you can check out its dedicated video if you haven't already. So back where we started, what do you think? I don't know exactly why, but these kind of interest me. Maybe it's because they have so much actual history behind them. Israel really has deployed the F-16 a great deal. They have flown it for coming up on 50 years. They have the largest fleet outside of the USA itself. And in a lot of ways, they've pushed development from the F-16D Barak through the F-16I Sufa. And I think it's an interesting compare and contrast with their F-15s. We'll look at those maybe next time. What do you think? Since I've got the 3 F-15s here from Israel. But I don't know, with this camera and felt like doing it on a Sunday. You're probably not watching this on a Sunday. I'm recording it on a Sunday. So, I don't know. And I needed to take these off the shelf and dust them off anywho. Let me know what you think. Appreciate you hanging out today. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.